Hello, welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 131. I have two guests in this episode, the first being Keith Frankish and the second being Matthew Segall. And technically, I've had both of these gentlemen on my show before. I recorded my interview with Keith and this dialogue with Keith and Matthew on the same day, and they'll be released on the same day. And I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation from the perspective that it was a good faith conversation to explore each other's positions and ideas and thoughts and metaphysical frameworks and theoretical frameworks and so forth. So it was a very good and productive conversation, and I feel like they both came away from the conversation feeling like something was accomplished. So I will ask you to assess that for yourself after you've listened to this. But thank you for your presence. I appreciate you being here, and enjoy the conversation. And I'd like to welcome the YouTube audience. Normally I welcome my guests first, but I've had Matthew and Keith on in prior conversations. They are perennial guests on my show, and so I will welcome Matthew and Keith, but I wanted to welcome the audience first. This is, to me, is such a treat to be in audience with these two gentlemen. I will have links to their work down below. I think most of the people who follow me subscription-wise and or coming here will know them, so there won't be any lengthy introductions. I just want to welcome them. So Matthew and Keith, welcome to you guys. Thank you so much for agreeing to get together. I'm sure a lot of people will be pleased to see this convergence here and this getting together.
Thanks for making it happen, Justin.
Oh, happy to do it. Happy to do it. I exercise the imagination a lot, and I'm like, who would have a good conversation with whom? So I thought maybe you two could, sort through some ideas and see where we go. So anyway, I'm grateful to have you guys. So as we discussed before we hit record, Keith, if you want to get this started, and maybe if you have a question for Matt relating to process relational metaphysics or anything, let's start with that.
Yes. Thank you, Justin, for setting this up. It's a great opportunity. Matt and I have interacted through social media over the years, and he's tried to persuade me to take an interest in process metaphysics and in Whitehead's work. And so I'm glad to have this opportunity to engage with him. I think. I mean, I'm pretty much a novice when it comes to Whitehead, and I've read little bits here and there, but some of his work is pretty difficult, I know. And he didn't figure very prominently in my philosophical education. There's been a revival of interest in his work, which you have helped in that. And my sense is that there's quite a bit of overlap between your perspective, your Whiteheadian perspective, and my own, but also quite a bit of disagreement. And it'd be really nice to tease that out, I think, and see exactly what the differences are and how important they are. So I wondered if you could, I mean, I think you have a pretty good idea of what my take on, at least on consciousness is. So I wondered if you could begin by sketching your take on it and highlighting how you see the differences between your position and mine.
Yeah, sure. Thought you might ask that. So I think I'll start with what we share, which is a desire to avoid construing consciousness in terms of phenomenal properties or, so-called phenomenal consciousness. I totally agree that we need to reconstruct our concept of consciousness so as to avoid defining it in such a way that it becomes about qualia or about intrinsic natures or about this private subjective experience that would be non-functional, non-psychological, in some way, totally divorced from anything that might figure in a physiological account of how the brain and the body functions. And while I often refer to my own position as a species of panpsychism, having spoken with your friend Philip Goff, it seems to me that the process, what I call the process relational approach to panpsychism, is as different from what I would call the substance property approach to panpsychism as it is for materialism, because to construe consciousness or experience as intrinsically private, I think what ends up happening is that consciousness then is epiphenomenal. I mean, we really should be referring to it as epiphenomenal realism or epiphenomenal consciousness and not phenomenal consciousness, because if it has no function, it's not actually doing anything. And so drawing on Whitehead, who is a very difficult nut to crack. I think, it's helpful to sort of trace his development as a thinker coming out of mathematics and then into physics, sort of living through what I think we have to call the second scientific revolution, when, this old mechanistic picture of what matter is was destroyed by physics. And Whitehead, lived through that, contributed to that, had, debates with Einstein about relativity. And before quantum theory was formulated, he was aware of the need to rethink matter as something that couldn't be understood at an instant. He would say there's no nature at an instant. And so this is where the notion of process comes in. Nor is there any simple location. It seems that, energy and fields have this non-locality, this entanglement. And so it turns out that the material or the physical world is quite weird. And, he definitely, as you put it in our email exchange, wanted to reimagine matter in more mind-like terms. It's perfectly fair to say that. But just like you would argue, and illusionists generally would argue, that we need to be careful about just trusting our naive intuitions about what consciousness is. Whitehead would say, yeah, physics has reimagined what matter is. We need to also reimagine what mind is. And what Whitehead would say, and what I've tried to develop in my work, is that, when we've shifted to an understanding of the physical world as sort of like, energy as a kind of like vibratory reiteration of pattern, that there's actually, turns out, maybe a closer analogy to like agitations of experience with this energetic conception of nature. And so, Whitehead's aim is that, and his claim is that we need not only a new concept of matter and a new concept of mind, but a more general concept of what a thing is that would include both of these aspects, the mental and the physical. And so, he develops a process ontology in terms of what he calls actual occasions of experience. And he uses the term experience, which, seems to bias it towards the subjective, towards the mental. But for him, an experience is what he would say, it's dipolar. Right. So there's a physical pole and a mental pole. The physical pole is what physics studies. It's about the inheritance of sort of efficient causes from the past. It's about, causal connections. The mental pole then is about possibility and how potentiality is integrated with what's been inherited from the past. And so when we understand quantum physics, say from Whitehead's point of view, when we talk about the wave function, what we're really talking about are fields of possibility. And so experience for Whitehead is about this integration of what's already been actualized in the past with what remains possible in the future. And so in each of these actual occasions where these mental and physical aspects are being integrated, there's a modicum of choice or decision or selection occurring, which is mind-like. And, there's all sorts of quantum woo out there that I think we should avoid. But But Whitehead's account of the fundamental nature of reality is in terms of these drops of experience or pulses of actualization, where what we understand at the human level as a capacity for like, you know, will and the ability to imagine, you know, the consequences of our actions before we take those actions. He would say that some minimal form of that type of selection or decision is present in all physical process, right? There's a bit of mentality in all physical process, which is just that decision which is occurring, that it doesn't seem that there's complete determinism in nature, right? There's always this field of possibilities opening moment by moment that's continuous with the past. And yet, even if we had, you know, Laplace's total understanding of the past, we wouldn't be able to know what happens next, at least on some interpretations of what, you know, quantum theory is suggesting. And so it's a full cosmological picture. It's not just a theory of consciousness. It's saying, okay, if we want to make sense of what's going on with this problem of consciousness, whether it's hard or just, you know, some other difficult problem that's solvable, he thinks ultimately we need to step back and ask these bigger cosmological questions and metaphysical questions. So that's my best attempt to lay out that framework initially.
Yeah, no, thanks. There's a lot of that I'm sympathetic to, particularly the rethinking of experience. And I think you're so by experience, he doesn't mean what property dualists, panpsychists mean by experience as the intrinsic qualitative nature that's known immediately to a self. That would, it seemed to me, would just be replicating this pernicious dualism everywhere. So it's not just that we've got a mind-body problem in us, we've got what in electrons as well, which is just taking a particular feature of how I think we misconceptualize ourselves and misconceptualizing everything in terms of it.
Right.
So, but now I'm sympathetic to this dynamic process-based picture of things, and that's how I think of experience. I think of, as I was in my conversation with Justin, I was saying that I think of experience as our, if you like, our resonating with the world, our whole being, our whole complex physical being resonating in response to a stimulus. And if you ask where a color is, you know, it's not exactly up there and it's not exactly in here. It is the resonance of us with the source of the stimulus, with the distal stimulus.
Yeah.
And we gesture at that with talk about ineffable qualia. But what we're actually gesturing at is not something intrinsically private. It's
Relational.
It's highly complex interaction with the world, which could, in principle, be entirely described in third personal terms, but that doesn't matter at all because it's, you know, it's our interaction. We're in the best position to describe it, and we're actually displaying it in describing it, in saying I'm resonating in this way. That's part of resonating in that way. So we have a sort of authority about it. So I'm quite sympathetic to all that, at least pushing it a little bit in my direction. What I'm less sure about is the idea of taking notions like experience and choice that are features of our psychology and the psychology of other animals, and then thinking that we can use those at a more fundamental level. That we can use those to help us conceptualize what's going on at a microphysical level. Maybe in some metaphorical way we could, but it seems to me that you only get things like purpose when you get, and teleology, when you get life, basically, when you get replicating systems, that's where you get design, that's where you get teleology, that's where you get purpose, that's where you get this sense of an entity for which things matter and which has goals and which can make choices. And so trying to project that back beyond the organic level into inanimate matter, there just doesn't seem to be this. I can't sort of de-psychologize those notions I can see how they can be projected right back down to cellular, even perhaps subcellular mechanisms. But I can't devitalize those notions, if you see what I mean, or see what's left of them that's any use to us, particularly the notion like choice. Can you give me some, can you fill in that notion, the making actual a potentiality? What makes actual the potentiality, and how does it do it? Is it anything like the process by which I decide whether I want, a cup of tea or a cup of coffee? And if so, in what way?
So one of the ways that, process philosophy invites us to reconceive of subjectivity would be to say that the subject doesn't pre-exist its experience. The subject is a result of a process of experience. Whitehead wants to reverse the vector of experience rather than having a subject that's already sort of there as like a substance that would then pre-exist its experience of objects. Instead, he's describing a process whereby the objective world, the past, that's already actual, is moment by moment flowing into these. He refers to this as a process of concrescence. It's a growing together of the multiplicity of objects already actualized into the past into this process of integration that he thinks is an experiential process, and that it culminates in a subjective point of view, which as soon as it is achieved, then perishes and itself becomes an object that would be felt by the next moment. And I know, this is a bizarre account of experience, but it's his attempt to render his understanding of relativity and quantum physics in terms that would allow us to bridge to something like experience. Now, you were saying that in principle, all of the function of brain activity and whatnot, like all of this can be explained in even our experience if we avoid qualia and intrinsic natures and phenomenal consciousness and all that. It can be explained in principle in third person terms. But who is, or described at least in those terms, who is doing the describing would be a question that I would want to raise there. Because I think that there is, while I want to avoid this idea of intrinsic nature, that consciousness is inherently private, I still think that this problem arises around the fact that we could give an account of the evolution of life. We could give an account of how brain physiology and brain function came to operate in the way that it does, in a way that doesn't make reference to consciousness at all, even to the ordinary sort of, let's say non-phenomenal consciousness. And so it still seems like on a purely functionalist account, third person account of, let's say, some future neurophysiology where we have a more or less complete account, we shouldn't have to make reference to consciousness or experience at all, right? I mean,
I wouldn't definitely disagree with that. Well, it's possible that consciousness may fractionate in the way that other psychological functions, memory and so on, have done. But it's no more, if we conceptualize it in third person terms, it's no more, in functional terms, it's no more going to vanish than any other, no more than digestion or thermoregulation, as they are complex psychological processes that are physically realized, or perception, say. So they're not going to vanish. It's you only see them when you, as it were, pull back the focus and look at the large scale activities of lots of components. You're not going to see them when you zoom in onto the fine details of the neurons, and you see there's just a neuron firing there. But then you're not going to see the Mona Lisa if you zoom in onto the individual pixels. You've got to see the complex pattern of activity, the immensely complex pattern. It's easy to think, oh, it's just neurons firing, as if it's just like sort of a little picture you've seen, interconnected, like a web of things. It's just that. Well, that's not feeling it. But look at the, there's 86 billion massively interconnected neurons. realizing immensely complex and functions, interacting functions. The idea is that it's all that. Dennett used the phrase "fame in the brain." Now that's a vague phrase, and that was deliberately vague because he felt that it was likely to fractionate. It was likely not to be a natural kind. But it's useful enough for us at folk psychology. I mean, folks, well, we talk about things being conscious and unconscious, being aware of a stimulus and not being aware of it. So it's picking up on something at a very gross level. And we conceptualize it perhaps in terms of some private inner world.
Right, which I'm trying to avoid in
Exactly.
saying that I think there's something missing in the functionalist account, because I agree with your criticisms of and Dennett's criticisms of qualia and the way that we could be just constitutively confused about our own intuitions and that I think there's a really important caution that you raised there, that we shouldn't just take our intuitions at face value. On the other hand, what's that?
So what's missing?
Well, because on the other hand, you know, if we're going to distinguish between a sort of folk psychological or naive understanding of consciousness, just the way people ordinarily talk about their experience and so on, if we're going to distinguish between that and a theoretical understanding of consciousness, it seems to me that theorization itself is always going to have a intuitive aspect to it, right? It's something that minds do. And, you know, maybe you could say, well, eventually we'll also understand how we theorize. We'll have a theory about theorization that's just in terms of brain function. But I feel like there's a kind of infinite regress going on there. And even if you want to construe this in terms of, you know, an illusion created by the brain's self-model, then it's like, again, an infinite regress. Well, you need another self-model of the self-model in order to theorize about how theorization might be possible. And I worry, and I know you've responded to this concern that critics have about sort of being self-undermining in the way that you're pulling the rug out from under yourself. If we can't trust any of our intuitions, then we can't make any knowledge claims at all. And I think, you know, you have decent ways of responding to that criticism, but is there not an intuitive aspect to theorization itself? Like, can we really divorce ourselves from the common sense understanding of consciousness so as to explain it from a scientific point of view without still relying on intuition?
Well, I think we can. I mean, then it said that intuition is just a word for a process that we don't have any access to. You know, it's, you know, an idea comes to you, and you don't have any access to the processes that generated it. So you say it was an intuition, as opposed to something that you actually consciously thought through the steps and you entertain the steps perhaps. So intuition isn't a thing. It's just an absence of insight into the nature of the thing.
But even entertaining each of those steps, that entertainment of each step is a kind of an intuition, isn't it?
Exactly. So it bottoms out in stuff you don't have access to. So the conscious story you tell about how you theorized is your gloss on what a few salient bits that really got to neural fame. You pick those out and tell a story about it. But there's a much more detailed story to tell that's at the subpersonal level. And some bits of that subpersonal story got boosted into fame, and you got to be able to report them and reflect them, and made an impact on you. And you strung them together and created a story that may seem to you like an adequate account of what happened. But it's not. I mean, stuff doesn't happen by magic. So if something came to your mind, grabbed your attention, was available for you to tell people about and to figure in yourself story, then there's a story about how that happened. But it's not a story you can tell pretty much by definition.
So,
So yeah, I mean, just the points, as it were, where thinking goes underground, where the stream of thought goes underground. They're not points where something magical happens. They're points where stuff goes on underground.
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously lots of subpersonal processes going on that we don't have intuitive access to. I like though that you leave open the possibility that cognition could, in some ways, penetrate intuition, and we could come to not be deceived.
Oh yes,
right, and change our own self-understanding of what these so-called intuitions are. But do you feel like that at the personal level, the way we interact as human beings is always going to be divorced from our scientific understanding of the subpersonal activities, say, going on in the brain, that there's always going to be an inability to bridge between those two. And we'll talk to each other like people do, but then we'll just have over here in this other compartment a scientific understanding of what's objectively going on.
I don't, you see, it's like a description of the world. As I said to Justin, we talk about things being solid, okay? You know, this table's solid, it jolly well is solid. But, of course, there's a certain scientific perspective from which it's mostly empty space. We talk about things being coloured, and they jolly well are coloured. But colour isn't quite what the colour, insofar as it's on the object itself, isn't quite what we thought it was. Science tells us there's just a certain sort of reflectance profiles there. The world, there's the manifest image of the world as it presents itself to us. And then there's the world as science tells us about it. Now, the manifest image is a sort of construction that has been shaped by eons of evolutionary processes to highlight stuff that's useful to us. We are essentially embodied creatures who have motivations that are deeply encoded into our nature. You know, the survival, keeping the whole thing together. And our sensory systems are designed to pick out bits of the world, to latch onto bits of the world that matter to that imperative. And this is, we call the manifest image of our image of the world. And of ourselves too. We are parts of that world. And so we have a manifest image of ourselves. And it's not wrong. I mean, it's latching onto stuff that's really there and that's significant for us, but it's not latching onto it in an impersonal way. It's not just providing an impersonal catalogue of stuff in the world. It's latching onto stuff that matters to us as the kind of creatures we are. So it's not latching onto ultraviolet light, though bees do latch onto ultraviolet light. It's not latching onto magnetic fields, though pigeons latch onto magnetic fields. They matter to it in a way they don't matter to it, and so on. It's the world filtered through our own interests. And that's a real vision of the world, a real version of the world. Scientists try to give a one that's stripped as much as possible of those interests, of those species-specific and individual-specific interests. And that's a different picture of the same reality. In some ways, the picture that scientists give is more powerful in that it's not tailored to a specific set of interests. And so it can be adapted to all sorts of other needs, technological purposes. And the only way you can have a conflict between them is if you take the manifest image to be presenting things as they really are. It's a selective, distorted take on the world, and science is trying to give us a less selective one, but of course it's still going to be affected by all sorts of human interests. I mean, even in the scale that we do it and so on, and the kind of investigations we do. So I don't see.
Well, I'd be curious to explore more how you think that the manifest and scientific images relate to each other. Because the way you were describing it there, it seems like you're suggesting that these are two different ways of trying to bring ourselves into more accurate relationship with reality, and that the scientific image is getting maybe closer to that because it's not species specific, whereas the manifest image is more based on the interest we have as organisms trying to survive. But would you say that the scientific image has ontological priority? I think you would, right?
Well, what do you mean by that exactly?
It's that if we were going to say map this onto the appearance reality distinction, the manifest image is an appearance and science is trying to get at the reality. I like that you're uncomfortable with that, but yeah, tell me about how you see them relating.
I mean, think about how Dennett put this. Think about folk psychology, talk about beliefs and desires. He didn't think that when we talk about someone having a belief or desire, we were picking out we were referring to some discrete internal state in their brains, like a sentence in a language of thought. He thought that was extremely unlikely. But he thought we were picking out something of real pattern in that person's engagement with the world. And I think that the manifest image is picking out real things, namely affordances things have for us. That thing is scary. That's a real aspect of the world as it is for me.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, describing it in scientific terms scientific description wouldn't mention the word scary. That doesn't mean it's not scary, because scary describes my take on it. Okay, it's my relation to it. Now, if you could describe in complete detail both the thing itself and my interaction with it, and then zoom out to a large enough level to take in all the ecological perspective, then the scientific picture would see this pattern that I've picked out in my crude way as scary. And it would say, oh yeah, that's the scariness. It's that complex interaction. Okay. So the point is that a scientific image can zoom out, both in time, you'd have to take in a lot of evolutionary history, and in scale, then it would see the things that are in the manifest image, provided that you've got it right, that you're applying the manifest image correctly. So I don't see a conflict.
So ultimately, the scientific image could expand enough to include the manifest image as some aspect of how, say, biological creatures figure in this picture of reality.
There's only one world, yeah.
Right. Okay.
There
So
aren't two worlds, one described by the manifest image and one described by the scientific image. And
right.
if they're both working correctly, then they're compatible.
Right. I wonder if you're familiar with this new book, The Blind Spot, by Evan Thompson,
I know which
Marcelo
one you
Gomez,
mean, and
Adam Frank.
Evan Thompson. I confess I haven't read it, though. It's on my reading list and high on it.
Okay.
And I'm
But you know the basic argument there, or
doing I this is I'd really need to read it. I think
sure.
I can I know the coming from, and I think I can agree with 90% of it, but I need to give you more
It
accurate
seems to me
story.
it's not that they don't use the seller's, distinction that we've been working with between manifest and scientific image, but they would say that there's a sort of irreducibly experiential origin to all scientific observation and theorization, and they're coming from a more phenomenological orientation. They draw a lot on Edmund Husserl, and they draw a lot on Whitehead, actually. And they would say that when they look at the history of science and show how ideas about temperature were born, and our capacity to measure temperature precisely and think of it in terms of the kinetic energy of molecules statistically, and all of this is all very important and valid and true, but it's also an abstraction abstracted from our felt sense of warmth initially, right? And so I don't know if Evan Thompson and his co-authors would be comfortable putting it this way, but I think, because when Sellers formulated the manifest and scientific image, he had a different purpose in mind. But I think in some ways what they're saying is that science is an outgrowth of human interests itself, right? It's a cultural activity. It's something that takes root in institutions, and it's human beings who are doing all of this research. And we're trying to approach ever more detailed understandings of what's really going on, and not, find and uncover systematic biases and all of this. But when you do you can do a kind of anthropology of science and see how like different cultures, like the way the Japanese study chimpanzees and the way that European and American researchers study chimpanzees, you would think you're talking about two different species sometimes, because of how we can't help but see how we are instead of seeing what there is. And does science really fully escape from that? I mean, it's definitely helping us avoid systematic bias, but it's ultimately still a human activity
Oh,
rooted in our experience, right? That would be
absolutely,
their argument, at least.
absolutely. It's more the direction of travel, that it's trying to compensate for these things, and as soon as these biases become apparent, scientists try in their human way to correct for them, and it's more in the nature of the process of science that it isn't taking taking the human perspective as secure in the way that some theories of consciousness do. Some actually found themselves on introspective intuitions in a way that doesn't allow for their corrections. They actually make them axioms of their theory, and I think that's not science. I'm naming no names. Sorry, a bit of a naughty there. So I see science as good. There's absolutely a story to be told about, how scientists have overestimated their own objectivity and so on, celebrated their freedom from these biases, which has been quite pernicious. But the ideal of science is that you try to correct them as far as you can. It's still humans who are doing it, and you're never going to be able to escape that. But I would think that alien science would converge gradually with our science if it's done in a self-aware, careful, reflective, modest, humble way. And because there's only one world.
One world, but so you're not a pluralist about scientific theorization. Like let's say there is an alien intelligence, you would think given enough time and let's say both species get lucky enough to converge, that we could in principle arrive at the one true, say, mathematical description of the physical world, that there, and in other words, there couldn't be multiple true enough mathematical descriptions that
could be ones that are predictively equivalent given our technology, maybe ones that are predictively equivalent under all possible circumstances, in which case I would say there's no fact to the matter. I'd be I guess, pragmatist about that. But I think we could converge on a heck of a lot. We could, where we disagreed, we could try and think of situations, experiments that would settle it. And if nothing would, then, well, questioning bottoms out at some point. But what I'm resistant to is the idea that when questioning bottoms out, you go back to intuition. As I feel some panpsychists are inclined to do. They say, well, what's the ultimate ground of all the, what's the ultimate intrinsic nature of all the structure that science describes? Oh, it's this thing that I know in my own mind. No, that's you don't do that. I mean, just call it grok or something or whatever. Just, if you want a name for it, but don't imagine that once you've pushed science to its farthest limit, you can then just go back to pre-theoretical intuition to take you up any further.
No, I understand that. So maybe let's try to come at this the other way around. Maybe when you say earlier, you said inanimate matter. Talk to me about what you mean by that.
Yeah, nice. I was thinking that you only get purposes when you get replication, really. But yes, you can tell stories about, you get interests when you get an entity that has an integrity and I'm trying to phrase this as carefully as I can. It's not easy. Mechanisms for self-preservation and replication, and therefore has interests, which in a way that say, a lump of rock doesn't have. It doesn't have any mechanisms for self-maintenance. It doesn't have any mechanisms for replication. It just kind of stays there. So that's the sort of distinction. Now, I suppose you could have inorganic molecules that maybe can replicate, and maybe we have some story about this for the precursors of life. So I wouldn't want to posit. I don't like sharp boundaries anywhere at all. So, and if you want to be, I mean, I was talking about consciousness as a sort of reactivity. Well, yes, of course, you can get reactions that are, things bouncing into each other and losing electrons and so on. You can get this at an organic level. But I think when you get to the things that we talk about as characteristic of living things are things for which living things are things for which other things matter, and which have interests and purposes, and they get those through being systems that try to maintain themselves and to replicate themselves.
Yeah.
So that's where I think all talk about teleology and experience and and all mentalistic talk gets its ground, and it gets its ground very early. I'm very happy to have these talk about memories and even beliefs and things at a very, very, very basic level, but not at a level before you get things with interests.
So in the non-phenomenal sense, you would
Oh, yeah,
say
absolutely.
even cells have some kind of experience and agency, single cells?
Look, I'd be willing to say that with the proviso that it's stripped of all the human connotations of it.
Yes.
The danger of saying something like that is that it sounds like that they think and feel, and they actually make decisions. But there isn't a sharp. This is one of my big things is
Yeah.
one of the things I really this line I just like this and I'll confess this at a sort of intuitive emotional level is the idea that there's a cutoff point between the conscious and the non-conscious among living creatures, that we can ask, are fish conscious? I think that's a terrible question to ask.
Yeah.
The question is, how conscious are they? In what way are they conscious?
Right. It's not an on-off switch. It's a spectrum.
That is one of my strong, and I feel that I think I think it's true, and I don't think I would defend it if I didn't think it was true. But I also found it ethically repulsive.
Mm. Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
I mean,
we have to divide nature into the sheep and the goats.
yeah. So from my point of view, I totally agree that there's a need for a kind of continuity here, and to whether we're talking about consciousness or life.
Mm.
I I I think we end up with another kind of hard problem if we think that there's some essence of life, just like there's some essence of consciousness. With that, there's a whole proximal zone of you know lifelike stuff going on between chemically replicating systems and then cells
Yeah,
which replicate, and you can even get something like natural selection going before
yeah,
you have
I
cells.
agree with that. I agree with that. Yeah.
But speaking of Evan Thompson and his work with Francisco Varela,
Mm.
there's an argument that they make about autopoiesis or
Mm.
self-production
Mm. Yeah,
actually preceding reproduction, at least logically.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
what's essential to life is not just replication of DNA or RNA, but the capacity to be more than just self-organizing. It's not
yeah,
just like tornadoes or hurricanes or something, but actually producing a kind of a boundary that
yeah,
distinguishes inside from outside or self
yeah,
from other, whereby organisms come to the world comes to matter to them in a specific way, right? And
yeah,
so they would emphasize self-production before reproduction or
yeah,
replication. Um, and if we take that route and we give it a Whiteheadian twist, then we can start to think about not rocks. I agree that rocks are probably accurately described as inanimate objects. They don't have
mhm,
they're not wholes. They're not producing the boundary which defines them from their environment, distinguishes them from their environment. But when we talk about a hydrogen atom,
mm,
you've got a self-organizing and perhaps self-producing process, a pattern that's reiterating itself, and it's a vibratory pattern that's reestablishing itself moment by moment, and can apparently it last hundreds of billions of years, as far as we can tell. So that's pretty good survival power for a hydrogen atom. Um, and if we want to maintain this idea of a continuum, there's no hard and sharp line between life and non-life. There's no sharp line between consciousness and non-experiential processes. Then it seems to me that we end up inevitably with a kind of a pan experientialism, I'll call it, where even uh, any self-organizing whole, and every whole is it's whole in a relative sense, that it's distinguishing in itself and from an environment and maintaining itself as a particular kind of pattern. I think would be a good candidate for the type of system we might want to say has some degree, however minuscule, of experience and agency, right? And so
mm,
maybe this applies for atoms, doesn't apply for rocks, which are kind of more like
mhm,
aggregates. Maybe it applies to things like stars. Maybe it applies to things like galaxies, and these, of course, would be very different kinds of experiential centers of experience than what we're used to as human beings. And the time scales are vastly different. It could be it takes a galaxy a million years to complete a thought. Whereas, for us, it's a second or two. I know this is highly
Yeah,
speculative.
I was happy to use the word thought. Um, you express that very carefully and very careful language, and until you use the word thought, and
Darn,
which is way too
I
folk
should have
psychological for me.
resisted. Yeah.
But if you stop without that word, let me give you two responses to that. One is, yeah, okay, I'm no bright lines, no essences. There's a certain kind of formal similarity there that I can see, and that it'd be worth highlighting with some language. And if you wanted to say pan-experiential, maybe you could get me to say, it's not the worst term in the world. But there's another side of me that says, hang on a minute, look, there are people who are wanting to say that kind of thing for totally different reasons. Not to just highlight this formal similarity, but because they think there's a mind-body problem. There's a problem about how brains produce phenomenal consciousness, and about how brains support libertarian free will. And maybe if these things were actually present, phenomenal consciousness and unconstrained free will, libertarian free will, in the basis of all matter, then we can explain how we have them by some sort of agglomeration process from the basic elements.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're using the idea of extending mentalistic concepts to the fundamental level to try and solve problems that I think are pseudo problems about human psychology. And their interest really is not in trying to provide a picture of the fundamental nature of reality, not really, but in trying to solve what they take to be these problems of within philosophy of mind.
Yeah.
And I very much resist that move. And so if you said pan-experientialism, if I thought and panpsychists are doing exactly that, okay, right? They're trying to solve mind-body problem by positing these minds in everything, and then supposing there's a combination. Very opposed to that. But if you wanted to say that there's enough formal similarity between what organisms are doing, living, and what some non-living systems are doing, that we could use a similar term for them, then I might be more sympathetic to it.
Mm.
So now I'm hoping you go the way that I obviously want you to go on that. Do you?
Yeah, I don't think libertarian free will or phenomenal consciousness are concepts that adequately describe the human level of our experiential reality. And so when I refer to agency and suggest that it might be present even at the level of a hydrogen atom or something, it's not free will in the sense that it's unconstrained by a whole history of efficient causes that are needing to be dealt with moment by moment. And so, to go back to what I shared in my first response to your initial question, experience here is not a private, it's not sequestered off in some private realm that's fundamentally distinct from, say, the structural relational features of energy transactions going on. It's fundamentally relational. Experience in this picture is fundamentally relational, which is to say, it's open to the influence of the past. And similarly, when moment by moment, that experience there are decisions occurring. And I know that's maybe too folk psychological of a term. Maybe choice is worse. Thought. I know. Okay, you don't like that one.
Resolutions, the actualization of potentiality, I suppose you could say.
Actualizations of potentialities. Yes. That actualization then has an effect. So what's going on experientially, what it feels like to be an atom, say, is not just the private business of just that atom. Like it's going to have an effect on the future. What's decided in that moment of experience, right? And so Whitehead has a term for this, prehension.
Yep.
And I feel like prehension is the concept that we would need to, I mean, he's constructed it and elaborated on its meaning and shown the analogies from understanding it in terms of energy vectors in physics to the way that moments of experience relate, across time. And I think it's a replacement for the idea of qualia, in the sense that it's no longer the intrinsic property of a conscious state. Prehension is a relational property, if you want.
Mhm.
It has to do with the way in which feelings, again, this is a term Whitehead uses, but I know it has folk psychological connotations, but
Mhm.
say non-conscious feelings
Mhm.
propagate through the world between experiential beings. And so, what I feel in one moment inevitably leaves its
Mhm.
publicly measurable effects that then you can feel in the next moment.
Mhm.
And so it's not private. Uh,
I yeah. I think to me that there's it's not exactly a tension, but I mean, we all have dangers of slipping over into views that are we sort of walk a tightrope, I suppose, between um, well, I think it was Andy Clark. I once heard him describe philosophy as walking this tightrope between the sort of the blindingly obvious and the wildly speculative. And we're all trying to. There's a lot of what you're saying that I like and that I resonate with, and I think, yeah, But at the same time, I worry that there are people who are doing something that superficially sounds very similar. The panpsychism people. I mean, or Philip Goff, who I love. He speculates about panagentialism, which is positing something like free will. At I mean, I mean, I don't want to caricature him, but the idea that the electrons do make a sort of choice, but they just choose to do what what the laws of physics say they'll do because that's all they want to do. Sort of, I think that's caricature. But anyway, but he really is, I think, using folk psychological notions and trying to import them into this level. And I think that is just replicating an error in philosophy and mind, and just sort of sort of making everything even worse, just introducing it into physics.
I'm
And
so
since
glad you two can stay friends despite the depth of
it's
these
nice,
disagreements. It's nice to
well,
see.
yeah, and there's a danger that you're too close to those people. I'd like because it seems, and I don't know how to express it. I don't know whether you really even need the the mentalistic vocabulary to get this across, because it seems to me what's important about this is the idea of connection, the idea of integration between, that we're all part of one system. That's what is and that's what is important to me. And it
Yeah.
doesn't really matter whether we describe this in mentalistic terms. In fact, it might be better if we didn't. It seems to me that Whitehead, I don't know if you'd agree with this, that I don't know, you know far more about him. It seems to me that he was a man who was extremely scientifically literate, mathematical genius, scientifically literate, and he he respected science. He didn't want to uh, uh,
Science is not a fairy tale, he
he didn't
says.
want to set himself in conflict with it. But at the same time, he had these humanistic impulses, and he wanted our intuitive sense of what reality is like to be preserved. It seems to have been a kind, gentle, and thoughtful, and very humane man, and he felt there was a risk that science would lose this sort of the beating heart of existence. I'm putting this in my own terms, and you could do it better. And
Yeah.
so he tried to find a way in which he could incorporate this meaning, this significance that the world has for us into the world itself, because he didn't want to separate it off into a private world. He was enough of a scientist to see that we're all part of the same world, but he didn't want to lose it, and he felt that science was in danger of losing it. So he wanted to find a way of putting it into the world itself. Would that be a fair way of saying what he was about?
Yeah, I think that's is describing accurately the tension he was trying to resolve.
And I think
Yeah.
it's one that we should all face. It's a question of, in a way, it's the old Victorian thing of faith and reason. How do we hold on to our humanistic values and our even spiritual values in the face of a description of the world that's saying they are? Then I want to do that too. I love poetry, and uh, not exactly I'm sort of not a religious person, but I understand, I think, what people are talking about when they talk about spirituality. We want that. I mean, Dennett himself said the way to be happy is to find something bigger than yourself and devote yourself to it. And we're all looking for that thing that's bigger than ourselves. And now, I think there's if you really take that serious, one thing you shouldn't do is make bets against science, so that your meaning depends on science being wrong in some ways. That would be a terrible thing, because then you could be refuted. If you have a conception of meaning or free will or something, or the significance of stuff that depends, that it could be empirically refuted, then you really are in trouble. So it needs to be one that sort of either builds it into, well, that some way builds it into the world. But I'm not sure it needs to be built in at that microphysical level. Why can't it be built into our story about the world? Why can't the significance be in the world we create? The story we tell about ourselves, the ongoing story of human life, which is manifested in many different forms in religion, in poetry, in scientific activity. In mathematics, it's the story of our trying to uncover both our own world, the manifest image, and also to explore the aspects of the world that are not manifest to us, and that building this story and contributing to this story is part of the meaning of life.
Absolutely.
That's sort of, I think that's kind of the way. And of course, the human emotions are central to this, and they don't need to be something outside the realm of science in order for them to be real and potent. That seems to me, I don't think I've ever really seen this conflict between science and meaning, whatever you want to call it. If there, insofar as there is a conflict, it's because you have a crude sort of mechanistic concept of what constitutes the meaning.
Yeah.
I'm scrabbling a bit there, but do you see where I'm going?
I'm very sympathetic to everything you're saying. And just to go back to Whitehead for a minute, I would say he was searching for a set of concepts, categories. He was attempting to do metaphysics at a time in the 20s when, Wittgenstein had said, we're done with that. And so it was very untimely what he was doing. But he wanted to arrive at a set of categories that were general enough to sort of drop a layer below these more specific differences that, modern philosophy had arrived at, say, between physical causes and conscious reasons, or between the motion of matter and the emotion of, our subjective experience. He wanted to find a set of categories that would be more general than those, but allow us to understand the common source of those ideas. And when you talk about and that's why he invented all these words, and it's really difficult to understand what he's talking about. But like the term prehension I introduced earlier, and there's obviously so much more I would need to say for that to become a salient concept for you, but it's an attempt to arrive at an understanding, a concept that would bridge between what we think of as causation in the physical world and what we think of as feeling in the subjective experiential world, right? He wanted to be able to show how actually there's one process there that operates at different levels that we understand in both these terms. And so he would say things like, memory is consciousness of causation, he would say, for example, built on this idea of prehension. And I know you might have all sorts of issues with that, but I just want to throw it out there. But to turn to what you were saying, more generally about making meaning, and there's no real conflict between the sort of existential concerns of the human beings trying to make their way in the world and be good people and enjoy art and all of these things. No conflict between that and our scientific understanding. I think I totally agree. And what I would ask is if you think it's accurate, say, in our account of cognition and the evolution of human consciousness. There's a theorist named Merlin Donald, cognitive psychologist, who, looking at sort of evolution of hominids, would say that culturally, like we start as narrative creatures, and then we've gradually developed this capacity for theoretical understanding, but that ultimately that capacity for theoretical understanding is always going to be rooted in not only our narrative forms of self-understanding, but even in like sort of mimetic like processes of imitation and like how we learn to be people by looking at other people as we grow up. And like there's a kind of scaffolding or a nesting here, and that like at the base level, there's mimesis, and then there's narrative, and then there's theorization. But you can't have the theorization without these lower levels of cognitive development. And so in some sense, scientific theorization is always going to be nested in and in a way out contextualized by narrative, right? And so science is a very important and valuable and effective way of making our stories better.
Mm.
But we're still fundamentally narrative creatures, right? This is another way of trying to, again, and I don't know that it's exactly what Sellers' project was, but saying that, we're never going to get out of the manifest image, and science is one way of deepening, enriching, and yeah, opening up that manifest image, but we're never going to get outside of it. There is no outside of it. It's like, it's not that the universe is what it first appears to be. It's not that we
Mm.
should just trust our naive intuitions. It's that our intuitions can deepen. We can gain more encompassing intuitions, and tell more inclusive stories, right?
Well, that's certainly true evolutionarily and developmentally. And yeah, we're not gods, we're not gods. We can't have, we're constrained by our cognitive abilities and by our cultural inheritance. And yeah, but as you say, that doesn't mean that the intuitions we started with are in any way epistemically foundational. They're just where we happen to start, and we try and work our way from them and try and do better. But they're still going to act as some sort of constraints. But that's not because, as I say, they have any foundational epistemic status. They're just where we happen to begin,
Yeah.
and then we just do our best from there. And I'd say that about the mind too. And too many people are apt to take their intuitions about the mind, the story they're inclined to tell about their own minds, as the revelation of a mental reality that is independent of the rest of the world. And that seems to me a point that is it's not just wrong and misguided. I mean, you can think that way for everyday purposes, and tell this story to yourself, and it maybe is useful. But I think that's a very dangerous way of thinking about ourselves and about our relation to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
It's ultimately solipsistic,
Yeah.
and that is dangerous. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I take everything you said. I don't really know Donald's work, but I think I'd be happy with that. Yeah. I mean, cultural evolution is the human mind is the product of the distinctively human mind is the product of cultural evolution,
Yeah.
and our ways of thinking are culturally
And
created.
yeah, no, our human beings' intuitive self-understanding has evolved for many thousands of years before we had the modern scientific method, right? And so it's not just that all of a sudden science came along and then we questioned our intuitions. It's like, no, the intuitions have been changing and cross-culturally are
Absolutely.
different, and so it's not like, one critique of the sort of intrinsic nature approach to panpsychism would be to say, well, you're taking a very modern Western understanding of
Absolutely.
experience,
Absolutely.
post-Cartesian understanding of experience, and saying, oh, that's universal. But I don't think that's true at all.
Absolutely. 100%. I think we're very close. It's where I see is maybe if your tradition is sort of over here and my tradition's over here, I see that I'm standing sort of there and you're standing sort of there, and we're just, we're
Yeah.
maybe, I don't know, or maybe there's another way of telling it in which we've always been on the same side. I mean, we began with the anti-dualistic thing, and again, that's something which, I mean, I think dualism is of all kinds is misconceived, and I think there's good arguments for saying that, but also I find it sort of ethically repugnant. The idea that we're all locked into, essentially, we're locked into private worlds that that are quite independent. It always puzzled me, this question: what happens when you die? What happens to what
Hmm.
when you die? um, what are you thinking? What do you think you are? That you might go somewhere other than the rest of you goes. I mean, it always puzzled me. Maybe because I wasn't brought up in a particular religious tradition, but I just couldn't make sense of the idea that I might somehow survive the loss of this thing that is me.
Hmm.
I say I couldn't conceptualize that. That's actually that's reporting my view at a fairly late stage. Very early in life, I could conceive it very early. In fact, I used to have out-of-body experiences. So there you go.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, maybe a better question is what happens when you're born. Might be more interesting, because then it focuses our attention more on, the mystery of what we already are. But on some
Absolutely.
level, I think, you see the death of Socrates behind me. I really do think philosophy ultimately is preparation for dying. And that all of our meaning in life has to be, in some sense, responsive to that fundamental fact that we will die, right? And if we can't make meaning in very close contact to that fundamental reality that we're mortal, then I think it's always that meaning is always going to be more or less superficial, more or less compensatory for the fact that we're in denial of our mortality.
I would agree with that because what we certainly something survives us. It's not it's not it's not me that
Yeah.
will survive me, but it's my influence that will survive me, and
Mm.
the impact that I've made on the world for good or ill, and that will certainly survive me. And that matters a lot more than what happens to some uh, um, um, numinous part of me,
Yeah.
because that concerns other people.
Right. And too much to unpack to really explain this, but in Whitehead's view of experience, the value of experience is always the effect it has on the future.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a very there's a deep, I think, ethical valence to his account where, one way to translate it, let's, to say the word spiritual, it's the spiritual significance of it. The lesson would be that the true um, the goods that we're trying to realize are really not for us. It's not for me. It's for those who will inherit the consequences of my deeds and my
Absolutely.
decisions.
Couldn't agree more.
Um, yeah,
And this nicely chimes in again with something that Danny said about consciousness. You get a bit of information to enter consciousness. Wonderful. You've, you've speculated about the conditions that must be met for it to get into consciousness. And then he said, then what happens? What are the sequelae? Sequelae of that? What consequences does getting into consciousness have?
Hmm.
If it doesn't have any, then it doesn't matter at all.
Right.
And if it does, then they are where all the action is.
Hmm. Yeah.
We're just under 10 minutes for your hard stop, Matt. And I wanted just to, bring that in. And and I hate to bring this to a close at this point, but please
We've made a
know,
lot of
uh,
progress, I think. This is great.
oh, this is a wonderful
I've enjoyed it.
conversation. Exceeded any, I didn't have, I go in, but thank you both. And so to state that you guys are welcome to come back. You can use my platform, or if you guys want to move on to your respective platforms or wherever, but I would love to have both of you back for another conversation. So maybe it would be a sort of a classic finish to have you guys sort of commit to some parting statement or an idea to share. I'll do mine real quick and just say what you just said, Keith, about, and both of you just said about, for me, I'd be horrified that there was some ghostly aspect of myself that carries on after this body's gone. But the idea, and I'll appeal to extended mind, that the filial components of our society inherit, as Whitehead might say, from a perished object into a concrescence of a new actual occasion, to try to use some Whiteheadian language, that what you two do and what I may do in my way lends itself to the future of a collective rather a mind, or whatever you want to call it, a collective society of ideas. So that's me. I'll stop there. I don't have any questions for either one of you because you guys had such a wonderful conversation. So Matt, if you want to maybe start that process of bringing us in for a landing here.
Well, I'll quote Whitehead, and I believe this is from Process and Reality. He says that he says a living body, and he means to include the experiential aspects of being a living organism, is to be interpreted according to what is known of other sections of the physical universe. This is a sound doctrine, but it is double-edged, for it carries with it the converse deduction that other sections of the physical universe are to be interpreted in accordance with what we know of the human body. He, again, doesn't just mean the human body from the third person point of view, but the human body as lived, like the phenomenologists would say, like the lived body. And so the idea there is, you know, we have these twin dangers of anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism. And like Andy Clark would say, there's a line to walk there. We want to avoid being overly anthropomorphic and just projecting our own, you know, species-specific modes of relation to the world and indiscriminately spreading that over everything else. But at the same time, we want to avoid the sort of anthropocentrism that would result from imagining that we are the unique and sole example of consciousness in all of the universe and all of the animal kingdom. And, you know, as someone I've had a few conversations with, maybe, you know, the biologist Michael Levin, he worries, and, you know, he's trying to find a framework that's empirically grounded that would allow us to say, hey, agency actually goes far much lower than we might initially suspect, and we should have an instrumental a way of gauging that that's, yeah, again, rooted in experimental evidence and so on. If we frame it as if these systems had agency, does that help us make predictions about their behavior? Then we should attribute agency. That would be his approach. But he worries about the way that we're so concerned about avoiding anthropomorphism that we miss features of the non-human world that might actually bear some analogy to, you know, what we think of as uniquely human. And so, you know, I'm trying to find an account that avoids falling into either of these extremes, being overly anthropomorphic or being overly anthropocentric. And it's difficult because language doesn't always cooperate, and words mean different things to different people in different contexts, you know. And so it's really helpful to have this conversation with you, Keith. And I feel like I will make a concerted effort to avoid what I admit are tempting caricatures of the illusionist position, because I know there are plenty of caricatures of it that are unfair. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Matt. And just, you mentioned Mike Levin there. I know he's someone that Daniel Dennett respected highly as a colleague, and they worked together, and they were admired highly. Yes, I'd like to thank Mike for introducing me to this Whitehead in perspective, which I confess I had not paid enough attention to. And I'd like to thank him for a really productive discussion. I think we both focused on areas where we could agree, and then I think we productively discussed the areas where we might differ. And I just want to make a plea for people to do that. It's true that there's a value sometimes in stake, and you know, with the name illusionism, I suppose I have done that. Sometimes it's worth giving a strongly worded statement of a position to try and shake people up a little bit, shake them out of their complacency. But that's just kind of advertising. The point is to have a productive discussion. And so maybe I wave a little flag and I say, look, I'm saying this, and, you know, and people say, what are you saying that crazy thing for? Come and talk then. You know, that's a signal for us to have a discussion. And we're all in the same project. We're all trying to make sense of things. We're all trying to make sense of how the way the world seems to us coheres with the picture that of the world that science is developing. We're all trying to make sense of this and trying to find meaning and purpose in it all. And the only way we're going to make progress on this is by dialogue. So a little bit of play acting of confrontation can be fun, as I do with Philip and so on. But ultimately, we're only going to make progress through dialogue, through listening to each other, through incorporating insights from other perspectives. That's the way the best of humanity has always worked.
Yeah.
By helping each other. And so I like to thank Matt for exemplifying this here, and thank Justin for setting it up. And I left just wanting to talk to you both more.
Wonderful.
Likewise.
Wonderful. Yeah. And this may sound corny, but I'm a general audience person, so I could say it is that this is very a wonderful synthesis between you two, and meeting in that overlap and that convergence to have a productive conversation, right? And rather than being ensconced and bracketed out and kind of wanting the dialectic to not be productive or the conversation to not be productive. So I appreciate that so much about what just happened, and the matter of progress, right?
No individual wins. We win.
Right, right. Progress wins and understanding wins and all these things that we aspire to, that we claim that we aspire to. And so I think you guys walk the walk on that today, and I appreciate that. And I appreciate you coming to my platform and having this conversation. This is strictly a volunteer project of mine. I'm not trying to sound weird, but I don't draw any revenue from this. This is the spirit of what I do and I love. And if it's a community service, that's great. But thank you guys for both taking the time to get together. And Keith, a double thank you to you for having a conversation with me. Once again, general audience guy, not educated in any way, but curious enough to ask what I hope were reasonable questions. Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
We had a world of such people, then it'd be a much, much better world.
That's true. And the epoche that I appeal to, that's just like, let it go and ask, and all that. And Matthew, thank you so much. I can't tell you how much I admire the time we spend together in conversation and listening to, like I said earlier, with you and folks like Timothy Jackson and other guests that you've had. I derive so much that influences me in how I think and gently and gingerly hold information in my space. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Glad to hear it. Yeah.
All right. And to the YouTube audience, some accolades to you as well for making it this far. I hope you took away from this conversation what I did, which I just feel enriched now. And so thank you for your presence as well. Gentlemen, I'll say goodbye to both you after I stop record. But again, to the YouTube audience, thank you. And I'll see you in my next episode. Take care.